but the whole idea of historical fiction is to fill in the gaps in the emotional feeling of the of the of the participants in the crisis.
Barbara Southard grew up in New York City, holds a PhD in history from the University of Hawaii, and has served as professor of history, chairperson of the history department, and associate dean of graduate studies at the University of Puerto Rico. She joins me today on Uncorking a Story to discuss her writing career and debut novel, Unruly Human Hearts. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Barbara.
I'm very glad to be here.
Happy to have you here, Barbara. I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
Think that it started in junior high school when I attempted to write a short, maybe it was more than one short story, but the one I remember is I attempted to write a short story that centered on bullying in junior high school. And because I had seen something happen to a young girl and it struck me very strongly. And that was, of course, a time when bullying was not as recognized as a social problem as it is today.
It was pretty much the norm. Even back in the '80s, when I was growing up, it was just something that you kind of had to deal with, and maybe you get a couple of people who would try and address it, but it was part of the growing up process. But what struck you so much about that specific situation that you felt compelled to write about it?
Well, I just felt very sorry for the young girl who was being bullied. And it actually took place in a subway station. I was afraid, that she might either jump or be pushed over. Somebody intervened and nothing like that happened. But yeah, but that fed the story. And then, of course, in high school and later in college, I was still interested in writing, but I got more into nonfiction writing and decided to major in history. I was very much interested in different cultures. And so I attended the University of Hawaii, and my dissertation was actually on India. Uh, but sometimes I think, of course, that this interest in other cultures, even though my book is about the United States, which of course is my native culture, it takes place in the 19th century, and you have to kind of imagine a different way of thinking slightly. Yeah, so that's true. And at first, I worked on the nationalist movement in India. That was what my dissertation was on. But later, I got more interested in social movements and wrote a book on the women's movement in Bengal, which is the northeastern state of India, and involved with the women's movement, women's suffrage in India, and looking at different aspects of that. And so then at the University of Puerto Rico, I taught the history of Asia and also the United States, and that's where I got involved in Elizabeth's story in Unruly Human Hearts.
All right. Well, we'll jump into that momentarily, but it strikes me, getting a PhD it probably involves a lot of writing. I imagine. I know that dissertations are typically not short pieces.
No.
What do you see as some of the bigger differences between writing for academics and then sort of writing, commercial fiction?
Very different. And I think that I was struck by that because my first attempt to deal with Elizabeth's story was actually writing an article for a history journal. So what I was looking for at that time were the social issues, the position of women, the difficulties that this adultery case caused for her more as a woman than it would have for a man, etc. Those social issues, social justice, etc. But then when I finally decided that wasn't really the complexity of the emotions, the love involved, as well as as issues of self-preservation, etc. Then I felt I had to go back to all those sources and reread them, looking for the emotional aspect rather than the social justice aspect. And of course, they're related, but it was a question of trying to get a feel for how they thought, and to the point where the main characters, their voices would come to me, in dialogues, and that's what you need for creative writing, which is very different from historical writing.
All right.
I
Well,
like both.
yeah, of course, of course. Well, let's get into Unruly Human Hearts. What can you share with us about your debut?
Uh, well, first of all, I thought continuing on that same subject of how I got into writing it, I was uh, it was in a graduate seminar class, which of course involved a lot of discussion with the students. And I was discussing the famous adultery trial of Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous preacher of his day. In fact, a book was written about him, called him the most famous man of America in his day. And we were discussing it, and and then one of the students said, but nothing much happened to him after the trial. He continued to be a famous preacher. And then we were talking about how this compared with the Monica Lewinsky Bill Clinton scandal. And someone said, oh, Clinton continued to be president, and he got impeached, but he wasn't convicted, etc. And so then someone said, yeah, but what happened to Elizabeth? And so I got interested in the woman's point of view. And of course, she was the only one who didn't have a public platform because her lover was the most famous man of the epoch, and her husband was a journalist with a platform, and it was difficult to find the sources for her point of view. But I did eventually find sources and found that some historians had actually been helpful because one of them published in his books, I didn't have to look for them each individually in newspapers, her letters, which her husband published without her permission in the press of the time. And these letters were quite revealing of her feelings.
Interesting. Interesting. In the course of your research, did you ever come across anything written by an author named Debbie Applegate?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
She was on the show a while ago talking about so I know she did a biography on Henry Ward Beecher, but she also has did another one on a famous madam. But I remember her she won the Pulitzer Prize, I believe, for that work on Beecher.
Yeah, and it was, I found it particularly insightful in terms of his childhood. And because his father was also a preacher and was a Calvinist who believed, of course, in God's retribution, punishment. And in childhood, they were made to feel very nervous, like because how you acted was supposed to reveal whether you were chosen, to go to heaven or to go to hell, right? And so he would be like, if he told a lie later, he would wonder whether that was a sign that he was headed down, not up. But you can imagine being sort of terrified with that aspect. And I think that had a great deal to do with his becoming a famous preacher of the gospel of love. That God is known for his love, not for his punishment, for his love and his care and guiding people on the right path. And this made him a very popular preacher. He was very good at it. And I think that one of the reasons he was so appealing to Elizabeth Tilton, the heroine of my novel, was that he related the gospel of love, God's love, to the love of a mother for her child and the guidance of a mother. And this gave an important position for women. And I think she even thought about not only a woman's position in the home, but in society. And I think that Elizabeth was in favor of the vote for women, which was a big issue at that time. And her husband was also in favor of women's suffrage. But Elizabeth saw it as a chance for women to vote in favor of helping the poor, helping children, that kind of thing, rather than a right as such, but as a vehicle to improving society and helping those most in need.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very interesting in that book that she brought out that. I thought, on the other hand, that her treatment of the affair between Elizabeth and Henry, she a little bit leaned too much to the sort of scandal, the minister taking advantage and I think that of a woman in his congregation, and I think that was part of it, but it was actually more complex, and that's what my novel tries to get into, the more complex issues of the love affair.
Right. Very good. Well, what more can you share with us about it?
Uh, well, I was very interested in writing it because a lot of writers kind of dismiss Elizabeth as a woman who, changed her mind about what actually happened, finally made a confession in the press, etc. But it didn't seem to be, they paint her as kind of a weak personality. And I thought, well, that has to be, you have to look in terms of the Victorian Code of Conduct for women, which was very strict. And that once the accusation of adultery came up, she was in a very difficult position. And she was very fond of both her husband and the Reverend and wanted to save both their careers as well as not lose her children, etc. So they were in a difficult situation. So I thought, one had to look into how she tried to maneuver to save the situation. And actually, she then appears to be a stronger character than you would think because she was up against this very strict Victorian code of conduct for women. But I also, I think I looked at it in the beginning of it from a point of view of gender inequality and the problems that women face. But looking at the characters of the Reverend and of her husband, Theodore Tilton, I also saw that the gender inequality of the epoch, the expectations of men and women were also difficult for men. And particularly the whole idea, of course, that everything about a man is told by his success in his profession, and also the concept of male honor. And so I looked into how this would affect Theodore, because once there was a public accusation that there had been adultery between the Reverend and his wife, then, he was almost, by the concept of male honor, obliged to do something about it, even if he personally believed in free love. So that's another very interesting aspect. And the other very interesting aspect is this belief in free love, which I think can be compared to open marriage in the latter part of the 20th century, and perhaps a little bit to polyamory, but that's a little more complex. But the idea of free love was that your husband or wife is your primary partner, but that primary relationship should not restrict expressions of other loves, which would include sexual expression, which doesn't mean that the free love idea was exactly the idea of promiscuity, but it was still the idea of having freedom, and that the state should not interfere in that. Those were the idea of the free lovers. And it was a movement at the time. And I think for both Elizabeth and Beecher, they kind of, although they had entirely separate origins, the gospel of love and free love, but they kind of saw it as combined. Love was the guiding ethical principle, and free love, well, you should be able to express those loves even outside of marriage.
I think of free love as something, in the 60s and 70s, of the 20th century, not necessarily of Victorian times. And so it's somewhat news to me that was even a thing back then.
It was, and there was an important leader of the women's suffrage movement, because the court case, the Beecher-Tilton court case, adultery case, was in 1875. Now, the women's suffrage movement has suffered a defeat because in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave suffrage to freed men, but not to women, which they had hoped that it would give to both. And of course, actually, the suffrage given to former slaves, male, didn't last very long when the Ku Klux Klan arrived, etc. But in any case, the suffrage movement was kind of looking for new angles, and this was the time when Victoria Woodhull became popular, and she was actually of a working class background and very attractive, a great speaker, and she was in favor of free love. But of course, this worked against the women's suffrage movement, because conservatives then, said, "Oh, yeah, there's a spokesman for women's suffrage who also believes in free love. They're trying to destroy our society," and etc. So so that issue came out, but and actually what she published kind of triggered the court case. Yeah, so it was interesting. But there were these two movements, and in the 60s, there was a second feminist movement, and then also later on the sexual liberation movement, which you're mentioning, which was the whole idea of open marriage and the idea that you had a primary commitment, but there could be other loves. Of course, the more recent polyamory is a little more complicated because you can actually have multiple. It's not in all cases is there a primary relationship.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we in today's culture anyway, we think about that as like odd religious sects allowing that, right? So, it was a show called Big Love, I think, on HBO years ago. And of course, you'd always hear, rumblings about, the traditional Mormons and allowing multiple wives and stuff like that. So but it still feels like it's on the fringe of culture and not necessarily mainstream.
Right. Now, of course, the free love people mainly they advocated sexual equality in this. I mean, free love was supposed to be for both, and of course, that was the that's kind of at the core of the problem in the novel because Theodore Tilton admits to his wife Elizabeth that he had affairs, and he justified them in terms of free love. This, of course, meant that, first of all, she was very much hurt, but then she forgave him. But then when she began to have feelings for Reverend Beecher, well, wait a second. But of course, it turned out that he spoke in terms of equality. He was very progressive on the women-male issues, on abolition of slavery, of rights for slaves, etc. But when it came right down to it, it was the double standard.
Well,
And it's hard to imagine a man who believed in free love accusing his wife's lover of adultery in the most famous trial of the century.
yeah, well, what's good for the geese is good for the gander. But when push comes to shove, sometimes, and I mean, I've heard stories, on various, podcasts and stuff where people talk about sort of a polyamory lifestyle or even sort of a swingers lifestyle, open marriages and stuff. And it's sometimes the men who say, oh, we should consider having an open marriage. And then when they can't find a partner, but their spouse does, then the SHIT hits the fan sometimes.
Right, yeah. Well, I remember in that epoch of the sexual liberation movement, talking with my women friends who said, "Oh, this sounds like a good idea," but at that time, of course, women were much less likely to be financially independent than they are today, and they just felt that the inequality would make it not work, and it would, it would still be free love for men, but not for women.
Right.
But I think it's complex because Theodore kind of tried hard to be open-minded about it, and yet it was difficult. And also the social pressure, because a man whose wife has an affair and it becomes public feels that his own reputation is challenged, particularly in that time. So that male honor question comes as well. So I don't think that either. I mean, I think perhaps Elizabeth had the most difficult time, but the two men didn't have an easy time either when Victoria Woodhull made it public.
Yeah. Well, if these events happen today, how if at all would this story be different?
But basically, I feel that it probably there's a chance that it would work, and that Theodore would forgive Elizabeth as Elizabeth forgave him for his affair, and they could go on with their marriage and their love for their children, etc. But you never know. And it's a question because I think that, we're still in an epoch, and I think right now there's some questioning of on the political scene of whether women's liberation has gone too far.
Mm. Yeah,
so that's a new question.
Yeah, I'd be curious if it would even be as big of a story today as it was, back then. I mean, I'm sure it would still be a story if you've got a famous preacher and, a congregant and all that. But I'm just curious as to the magnitude. Would it be the trial of the century, or would it just be, a news item on, page B20 of the newspaper?
Yeah, I think you're probably right that that it would not have caused the same controversy, right? Uh, and that there's more acceptance. And I think even today it's a little bit different than it was at the end of the 20th century because the Monica Lewinsky story did cause a huge scandal. Yeah. But of course, and it's also true that there's always a question of political or economic interests that are involved, because one of the reasons that the trial went on and they kept pushing for it was the struggle within the church organization, because the Reverend Beecher was very famous. There were other preachers that were envious of him and saw him as an enemy and saw a chance to so yeah, so that political and economic issues and rivalries can also have a lot of influence on whether it becomes a huge public scandal or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what I'm curious about, because a lot of writers listen to this show, this being sort of a debut novel. What did you learn about sort of the writing process and writing fiction that's different than nonfiction or even the short stories that you have written before?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I think, first of all, since it's historical fiction, as I mentioned before, I learned that looking at historical sources is very different when you're trying to write a novel. Now, my concept of historical fiction was to tell the story within the confines of what is generally known as what happened, not to invent things completely. But of course, there were more sources for some period of Elizabeth's life than for the earlier period than for the later period. But the whole idea of historical fiction is to probe into things that uh, to fill in the gaps in the emotional feeling of the of the of the participants in the crisis. And also, I think that historical fiction serves very well uh, to present the point of view of women in many epochs and of people who have less power in general, whether they have less power for racial reasons or economic reasons, they haven't been educated, because most historical sources are uh, written sources, which tend to be left by people who had education, influence, etc., who tend to be in have powerful positions. And I think historical fiction permits you to take the point of view and use whatever sources you can get, the wonderful letters in my case, in order to fill in how the scene of a great historical event looked from the point of view of those with less power. And I
Yeah.
think that's important.
Well, yeah. I mean, they say history is written by the winners.
Yeah, exactly. And I think increasingly I look at recent historical fiction, and I don't think I'm the only one who sees it that way. That there are a number of writers who are trying to give voice to those who didn't have as much voice in their epoch.
Yeah. So if somebody came up to Barbara at a book signing and said, "Hey, I really admire what you've done. I want to do what you do. I want to write. I want to take a stab at writing historical fiction." What advice would you give an aspiring author?
I think, first of all, that you have to find a historical event or a period, but really an event that that really interests you, that awakens emotions in you, in order to make that the subject of a novel. And in my case, it was, starting as a historian, being interested in the social implications, the social issues involved in this famous trial, and then later becoming kind of emotionally involved with the three characters. And I think that's a very important part, which makes fiction different from writing an academic article in which you're dealing more with issues. But here you're dealing with personalities and people who are facing difficult issues. But it's a question of like hearing their voices and feeling, being able to feel as they would feel, or at least do your best to do so.
Yeah, you've got to channel them somehow, it seems. And if you're not interested in the subject matter, it might be difficult to convey that emotionally on the page.
Yeah, and you have to, and the personalities have to draw you in to some extent. Whether and I think it's important that you don't only see the personalities in a positive or negative light, but you see them in their emotional complexity, because then you're creating in fiction what life is really like, which is it's not black and white. It's complex, and the same people do good things and bad things and have complex motivations for what they do.
Yeah. And I imagine, I know you mentioned you're filling in the gaps, but you can't have too much creative license, because, it has to be true to kind of what was happening at the time, right? I mean, is there something like you can't, something inside of you that says, I can't go too far with this, because, this events, did actually happen.
Right. Yeah. But there'll be gaps where there's not much information, and you have to fill in with what you think logically, what your own emotional feeling about the characters say would have driven them to make this decision. And another thing, of course, as a writer of historical fiction, at the end of the book, you can indicate that all of this was based on them, but then there are certain incidents which I don't have as much factual basis for, but fit in with the character, so that your readers know what came from actual accepted fact, and what is a creation. And I think that's a good idea. I like it when historical fiction writers do that when I read their work.
Well, Barbara, where can people learn more about you if they're so inclined? Do you have a website or social media that you're active on?
Yes, I have an author's website in my name, Barbara Southard, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram.
All right. I'll be sure to put links to your profiles and your website in our show notes. And tell me, where can people buy Unruly Human Hearts?
Barnes and Noble, and Amazon, and Simon and Schuster.
All right.
Those are the three. Yeah.
Very good. Well, Barbara, I will say thank you so much for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Oh, okay. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation very much.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest, or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.